The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another Weird Tales Radio Show podcast. My name's Charles Christian, I'm your host, and thank you for joining us. Our big topic this time around is going to be witchcraft, ancient and modern. We'll be getting on with the show in a moment, but before we do, here's an interesting little news story I picked up the other day. It's apparently that Stonehenge was party central for Britain's late Neolithic population. Scientists have been examining the pig bones found near the site in various enclosures surrounding Stonehenge and also Avebury. And by running isotope tests, they've discovered that although the pigs could quite easily have been reared and then cooked and eaten locally, the pig bones actually were from animals raised in Scotland, the northeast of England and even West Wales, as well as other locations across Britain, which leads scientists to think that people from those areas were driving their pigs down to Stonehenge for various festivals where they'd then be sacrificed, cooked and eaten. So, party central time. Well, that's good news, isn't it? Right, on with the show. I spotted a story the other day that writer called Stacey Halls has a new book coming out called The Familiars, and it's fiction, and it's all about the Pendle witch trials. We covered the Pendle witch trials on this podcast in the past, but it got me thinking, what other witches in the UK, England, what other stories have we got that we haven't told before? We tend to hear the same ones, the Matthew Hopkins, Witchfinder General stuff, and the Pendle Witches. And I found this one. It's the Witches of Belvoir. And now, first of all, a little note for our American listeners. This is British English pronunciation. So Belvoir is actually spelled Belvoir, which you might think would be Belvoir. But I say, this is England, so it's Belvoir, as in the little furry creatures that build dams in rivers. My source is a tome called The Book of Days by W.R. Chambers, and it's a Victorian-era book, and the edition I've got is 1888. There's 2 volumes of it, and it's a wonderful compendium of popular folklore stories, legends, myths associated with the days of the year. Fascinating reading. So, what can I tell you about the Witches of Belvoir? All began on the 11th of March in round about 1618, or it may have been 1619. There's a little bit of vagueness there, but that's due to the fact that we still were on the Julian calendar in those days, as opposed to the modern Gregorian one. So a little bit of vagueness, but basically we are looking 400 years ago. And it's about 2 women named Margaret and Philippa Flower, and they were burnt at the stake at Lincoln for the alleged crime of witchcraft. They, along with their mother Joan Flower, had been servants of the Earl and Countess of Rutland, whose stately home is Belvoir Castle. They were dissatisfied with their employees, and eventually they decided, in the words of the description, to practice hidden arts in order to obtain a revenge. According to their own confessions, they had entered into communion with familiar spirits by which they were assisted in their wicked designs. Joan Flower, the mother, had hers in the bodily form of a cat, which she called a rutakin. They used to get the hair of a member of the family and burn it. They would also steal one of his gloves and plunge it into boiling water or rub it on the back of a rutakin in order to effect bodily harm to its owner. They would also use frightful imprecations of their wrath and malice towards the objects of their hatred. Lovely language, that. In these days they were believed to have accomplished the death of Lord Ross, the Earl of Rutland's son, besides inflicting frightful sickness upon other members of the family. It was long before the Earl and Countess, who were an amiable couple, suspected any harm in these servants, although we are told that for some years there had been a manifest change in the countenance of the mother, a diabolic expression being assumed. Just as a little aside, he'd thought if you'd got some grumpy servants, perhaps you'd sack them, but never mind. At length, at Christmas in the year 1618, the noble pair became convinced they were the victims of a hellish plot, and the three women were apprehended and taken to Lincoln jail and examined, which is a polite way of saying tortured. The mother, that's Joan Flower, loudly protested her innocence and called for bread and butter, and wished that it might choke her if she were guilty of the offences laid to her charge. Immediately upon taking a piece of the bread and butter in her mouth, she fell down dead, which, as the writer of the report says, as we may allowably conjecture, overpowered by the consciousness of the contrariety between those protestations and the guilty design which she had entertained in her mind. In other words, she was so guilty she actually choked on the bread. This then left Margaret Flower, and being examined, she acknowledged she had stolen the glove of the young heir to the family, this is the one who died, and given it to her mother, who had stroked the familiar rutakin with it, and had dipped it in hot water and pricked it, whereupon the young lord fell ill and suffered extremely. In order to prevent Lord and Lady Rutland from having any more children, they had also taken some feathers from their bed and a pair of gloves which they boiled in water, mingled with a little blood. In all these particulars, Philippa corroborated her sister. Both women admitted that they had familiar spirits which came and suckled them at various parts of their bodies, and they also described visions of devils in various forms which they had associated with from time to time. Associated with the Flowers in their horrible practice, I'm quoting again, were three other women of the like grade of life, an Anne Baker, a Joan Wilmot, and an Ellen Green, all in Leicester, whose confessions were much the same purpose. Each had their own familiar spirits to assist them in working out their malignant designs against their neighbours. That of Joan Wilmot was called Pretty. It had been blown into her mouth by her master, William Berry, in the form of a fairy, and immediately came forth again and stood on the floor in the shape of a woman, to whom she forthwith promised that her soul should be enlisted in the infernal service. On one occasion, at Joan Flower's house, she saw two spirits, one like an owl and another like a rat, one of which suckled her under the ear. This woman, however, protested that, for her part, she only employed her spirit in inquiring after the health of persons with whom she had undertaken to cure. Right, and then we have Ellen Green. She confessed with having had a meeting with Wilmot in the woods. That's Joan Wilmot. The latter had called two spirits into their company. One was like a little kitten, and the other like a mole, which, on her being left alone, mounted on her shoulders and suckled her under the ears. She then went on to say that she bewitched a man and a woman who had reviled her, and had accordingly died within a fortnight. And then there's Anne Baker, who seems to have been more than a visionary than the rest. She once saw a hand and heard a voice from the air. She had been visited with a flash of fire, and all of them ordinary occurrences in the annals of hallucination. She also had a familiar, but as she alleged, it was a good one, a beneficial one in the form of a little white dog. And there we have it. Baker, Wilmot and Green, each with their familiar spirits. The examination of these wretched women was taken by magistrates of rank and credit, and when the judges came to Lincoln, the two surviving flowers were duly tried and, on their own confessions, condemned to death. And that is the sad tale of the witches of Belvoir in the year 1618, 1619 here in England.
Something wicked this way comes. Weird Harvest Press presents Harvest Hymns, the sweet fruits and twisted roots of folk horror, a 2-volume set of books investigating the music of folk horror, featuring contributions from some of the biggest names in the field: Candia McCormack, Johnny Trunk, Maddie Pryor, Sharon Krause, Jim Jupp and Kemper Norton, to name just a few. Available now via lulu.com. 100% of all Weird Harvest Press profits are donated to wildlife charities.
Welcome, fool. You have come of your own free will to the appointed place. It is time to keep your appointment with the Wicker Man.
Right, Jason. Roll the twinklies, as we call the sound effects. Jason's our sound engineer here who makes this whole show hang together in one coherent piece. We've got another bit of practical magic to discuss. A friend contacted me saying he was going off to travel to somewhere slightly dangerous, and did I have any simple travel protection spells he could try. Well, here's 2 of them. For this one, you need a single clove of garlic and you need a small glass mirror. Kind of mirror you'd have in a lady's compact, but you might well want to have one in your shaving kit. What you do is, at night, you crush and peel a single clove of garlic and rub it against the glass of the mirror, and then place the mirror face up beneath your bed. We've all heard the thing that garlic keeps away evil spirits and vampires. Well, it's really the same idea here. The mirror reflects the aura of the protective garlic upwards through your bed and surrounds you. Obviously, you may well need an extra or strong shower in the morning, as you'll be smelling of garlic. The second one is shape a piece of a red flannel into something the shape of a finger. So just a little small tube of fabric. Stuff it with either crossroads dirt or coal dust or antimony powder, which you may also find as coal, that's K-O-H-L, as opposed to coal dust, C-O-A-L. Add a piece of real silver to it. Remember, most silver coins these days don't contain silver. So a little piece of silver, then sew up the charm, which is usually a mojo bag, and carry it with you. And that should help you stay protected. And of course, double benefit, the mirror and the garlic at night, and the little mojo bag of coal during the day. Travel safely. Now for 2 tales of sorcery, one ancient, one modern. Let's start with the ancient one first. And we're talking about a character called Hugh Draper. That's H-E-W as opposed to H-U-G-H, should you be writing notes. Don't worry, you're not going to be tested on this. And he left some distinctly black magical graffiti on the stonework of the Tower of London. Hugh Draper was a 16th century Bristol innkeeper who got sent to the tower for attempted sorcery. He claimed that he was interested in magic, but had burnt all his magical books. However, while he was incarcerated in the Salt Tower, the engravings he carved on the wall suggested that he actually knew rather more about the dark arts than he was letting on. On one wall he carved a large and detailed astrological sphere with zodiacal signs. It's got various numbers on it and crisscrossing lines linking the powers of the stars. And nearby is another image he carved, a picture of an astrological globe, again full geometric accuracy and detail, and on the zodiac design he wrote, "Hugh Draper of Bristow made this sphere the 30th day of May, anno 1561. Now it's intriguing because most people who were incarcerated in the Tower of London tended to be carving Christian crosses and generally praying for salvation and deliverance, whereas Draper's images are completely the opposite. And a very dangerous thing to do, considering that if he'd been found guilty of sorcery or witchcraft, he would have been hanged. Had he been found guilty of heresy, he could possibly have been burned at the stake. This is in England. Other countries dealt with sorcerers in a slightly different way. So there he is. Draper wasn't a priest. He wasn't a scholar. He wasn't even a gentleman. He was just an innkeeper. And then there's an added mystery. What happened to Draper? Nobody knows. His death is not recorded in the Tower records, which they would have been. There's no account of him escaping or him being released, or any details of his later life. So perhaps he actually was practicing sorcery and somehow enabled himself to escape from incarceration in the Salt Tower, in the Tower of London. That's Hugh Draper from 1561, 500 years ago. Now let's flash forward to the present time and look at sorcery in Iraq. Now, the interesting feature here is that following the invasion of Iraq, the collapse of Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime, the civil war that followed, many of the aspects of modern, what we call civilized society, have broken down, and people are resorting to old-fashioned practices and superstitions. It's estimated, this is according to Patrick Cockburn, a journalist who's been reporting on the Middle East since the 1970s, it's estimated that there are now around 3,000 sorcerers operating in the Baghdad area alone. These witches and sorcerers actually advertise their skills on Facebook and sometimes on television, and charge between $400 and $6,000, depending on what kind of help you need. Their customers apparently include those in need of help with love and marriage, health and employment, hopeful politicians seeking re-elections, and citizens who want to influence government officials to sign documents or not to sign documents. This, Cockburn points out, is that Iraqis currently spend a very large amount of time dealing with a fairly corrupt and impenetrable bureaucracy. So you call on a sorcerer to help ease the machinery. The most famous sorcerers who can actually be employed from abroad insist on payment in advance by bank transfer. So we may be dealing with ancient dark arts, but we are using a bit of modern technology here. Cockburn says the increased belief in witchcraft and superstition may be due to several factors, including the insecurity and instability following the Iran-Iraq War of 1979, then the American-led invasion in 2003. There's plummeting standards of education, a shortage of doctors. Many have left the country, and so there's more reliance on faith healing and magical cures. All of these, Cockburn suggests, mean Iraqis feel at the mercy of events beyond their control. As a result, boosting their belief that good and evil spirits can be influenced to affect human affairs. In the area around the notorious prison of Abu Ghraib, ghosts are said to infest the streets, crying out at night. Farmland in the district has fallen into disuse, and 70% of the 450 houses near the prison have been abandoned or have been on the market since 2010 for a quarter of their previous price. One man who bought such a house later claimed it was haunted and unsuccessfully sued the seller for not warning him in advance. He said, "I didn't know anything about the history of this area. We are now frightened in the house. At night everything gets creepy and the dogs and cats act strange." And sorcerers apparently get on this act too, charging, and it's a quote here, tens of thousands of dollars to perform exorcisms. You can find more about it in the October 2018, that's volume 40, number 19, of the London Review of Books.
If you want to grow your business, save time using the latest tech, and look great online, Weird Appeal Digital can help. We have a free, yes, that's free download listing 40 digital tools, apps and resources to help you grow your brand, promote your project, generate leads, and reach your audience. Just go to www.appeal.digital/weirdtales for smart, effective digital design, and your free download. Go to www.appeal.digital/weirdtales.
Now for a little piece I call The Ghost on the Street Where I Live. That could be a song, couldn't it? As you know, when we start each of our Weird Tales radio shows, we have the line about the ghost at Misery Corner isn't working tonight. Isn't walking tonight, probably not working either. So what can I tell you about Misery Corner here in the little South Norfolk village of Denton? Lurking in a field full of grazing cattle, at the northwest corner of the Waveney Valley village of Denton can be found a battered earth mound surrounded by a dank ditch, all that remains of the village's old Norman-era Motte Bailey castle. However, the proximity of a rookery within and the adjacent wood gives the place a suitably ominous, spooky atmosphere at dusk. This is all the more appropriate given two grimly named locations close by this castle site, namely Hangman's Hill and Misery Corner. The first, Hangman's Hill, is a small tree-covered mound to the east of the castle that was supposedly the location of a gallows and the site for executions. Sadly, there's no historical or archaeological evidence to indicate executions ever took place here. There's not even a good place to mount a gibbet, and the more likely explanation is the mound is spoiled from the digging of an adjacent pond, which was then given a more melodramatic name during the Gothic revival in the late 18th and early 19th century. As for Misery Corner, located on the corner of Manor Farm Road and Darrow Green Road, the latter about half a mile from where our studios are, one suggestion is that it takes its name from being one of the last places anyone being dragged off for execution at Hangman's Hill would see in their life. But as we've already said, nobody was actually hanged at Hangman's Hill. Another suggestion is it's linked to a young servant girl who committed suicide there after either falling pregnant and or saw her lover being taken off to be hanged, with obvious caveat that no executions took place there. And certainly there are plenty of reports of people claiming to have seen the woman's ghost haunting the area, although there is some confusion as to whether she hanged herself at Ivy Farm, one of the houses at the corner, or else drowned herself in the pond that's also located there. However, another macabre but possibly more plausible explanation is Misery Corner is a road junction on what would have been the edge of the village. It's another place like Lushbush in nearby Harleston, where suicides suffered the miserable fate of being buried with a stake through their hearts. It sounds barbaric, but this was a fairly common practice until the law was changed in 1823 in England. And it's quite possible that if the Ivy Farm servant girl had committed suicide, she would have suffered the fate of being buried at the road junction with a stake through her heart. As for Harleston and the Lushbush site, the last public burial of a suicide with a wooden stake driven through her heart took place there in April 1813. And that was a woman who quite clearly had killed a child while suffering from postnatal depression. So there you go. There is misery at Misery Corner. It's got nothing to do with Hangman's Hill, though. More likely the scene of the last place a suicide would be buried. And we're almost out of time. However, before we go, let's squeeze in one last story. And just as we began with a food-related story, the long-distance travelling pigs at Stonehenge, this has also got a foodie flavour, and it's based on a report carried out in Switzerland, where the people there were exposing Emmental cheese. These were large 22-pound blocks or 10-kilo blocks of cheese, and they were all placed in separate wooden crates last September to test the impact of music on their flavour and aroma. And the results have now been released. Now, I said there were 9 cheeses. One was subject 24 hours a day to a Tribe Called Quest's hip-hop track, We Got It From Here. Another had Mozart's Magic Flute opera playing. Another had Led Zeppelin's rock classic Stairway to Heaven. Another cheese had the techno track Vril's UV, and another had the Yellow's ambient piece Monolith. 3 others were merely subjected to either low, medium or high frequency sound waves, and the final one was left in peace. And it was then researchers brought out a culinary jury who did some blind testing to judge the cheeses on their flavour, smell and taste. And lo and behold, the hip-hop sampled cheese topped the list in terms of its taste. Benjamin Lucy, a Swiss TV chef and a member of the jury, told Reuters that the differences were very clear in terms of texture, taste and appearance. There was really something different about it. So there you have it. Hip-hop makes happy cheese. Cheese. Pickle. Yes. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much for being with us. We hope you'll join us again next time. But until then, stay well, stay weird, stay different. Good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @urbanfantasist. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.